Anybody have a dog? If you have a dog, come on, Mike. Anybody have a dog?
I have a dog.
Allison has a dog.
Yep.
Allison, do you ever like take the dog out to like a nature park or like a walking trail and let the dog off leash?
No, my dog wouldn't be able to go off leash. She's too hyper.
Okay. So typically, if you let a dog off leash in the woods, what'll happen is the dog will run really far, and then typically it'll stop and sniff around a little bit while you catch up. Allison, have you ever experienced that at all?
No. Well, he was let off leash one time, but he got hit by a car. But he's okay now. But that was the only time he's actually been off leash. So.
And when you let him off leash, did he like run very far for a little while and then he just...
Yeah, he ran through some backyards and then he like stopped, and I think that's probably what, like, because he stopped in the middle of the street. So
Yeah, this seems like an atypical example of what we're talking about. So maybe it's not.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not a big help explaining the example.
Does anybody else have a dog? Does anybody else's family have a dog? Has anybody ever walked a dog in the woods off leash? Okie dokie then.
I have a dog.
Oh, sweet. And who are we speaking to?
Claudia.
Claudia, you have a dog. Do you ever walk the dog off leash in the woods?
We have before, not often. My dad just did.
Let's move forward with the conversation. Otherwise, I think that we might be running into a dead end here. When you walk a dog in the woods, typically what will happen is the dog will run really far and stop. And then you'll catch up to it. And then the dog will run really far again and stop. And then the whole time that the dog is running fast and stopping and panting, and then running fast, stopping and panting, the human being is just a continuous, smooth, aerobic effort. A human being can keep walking and walking and walking and walking and walking for a long period of time. A dog typically will race and stop, race and stop, race and stop. Claudia, Allison, is that experience familiar at all or no? Otherwise, I'll just keep moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, so that's reasonable. So we'll give a check mark for the walking a dog. Typically what will happen is if you let the dog off leash and you're in the woods, the dog is going to run like, I don't know, some distance ahead. But you don't have to worry about the dog running away unless the dog is Claudia's dog. Because usually the dog will run, and then stop. And it'll sniff the leaves, and then you catch up to it. You're walking continuously, you catch up to it, and then boom, the dog will race off ahead for the same distance. And then sure enough, when you catch up, it'll be panting and sniffing the leaves and checking to see whether or not you got there. And then the same process repeats. Last week, I believe it was Columbus Day or Indigenous People Day. And one way of hunting that the indigenous people used was bow and arrow. But another way that they hunted deer was they would track them. They would follow the deer and track the deer and exhaust the deer. And eventually the deer would have to stop and rest and gain energy and breathe and pant. And when the deer was resting, the hunters would find them, take them by the antlers, twist the antlers and break the neck. And then that's how they would hunt. So how could a person catch up to a deer? It's an interesting way of hunting, where you're not hunting based on, you know, a ballistic means like a spear or an arrow or a gun. You're using physiology to hunt. So the same thing, the same question. Why would a dog need to rest intermittently? How is it possible for a person to literally track down a deer and kill it with their own hands? And here's something really cool too. The shape of Massachusetts. Let's take a look at this. Now, if you look at like the United States, man, this is not going to be a good picture of the United States, but this is good enough. If you look at the United States, like around here, all of the states are like this. Like they're all like squares. But if you look over here, Maine is like this, you know, or like, and then New Hampshire is like this, and then Vermont is, but then Massachusetts has this weird shape to it. And Delaware is this round thing here, and New York is this, and everything is like oblong over here. But everything is much more square over here. That's interesting. If you take a look at Massachusetts itself and you blow Massachusetts up, all right, it'll look like this. This isn't exactly what it looks like, so chill. All right. And if you blow this up even further, you'll notice that like the towns are really weird shaped, or the counties are really weird shaped. Nothing is square in Massachusetts. Everything is like this. It's like weird shapes. Maybe the Cape gets a little bit more even, but everything has these like weird town shapes. But if I undo, and I look at where the town centers in Massachusetts are, that's a different story. Because the town centers are all equally distant from each other in Massachusetts. So the centers of the town are all equally spaced. And I'm speaking in hyperbole. I'm exaggerating a bit right now, obviously. But the distance from this town center to that town center is the same as the distance from this town center to that town center. And if I put like the counties back, or the states, or the cities rather, they might be a little bit oblong looking, but they're all organized around these town centers that are equally distant from each other. That. So even though the towns have different shapes, the distance between the town centers and the next town are all the same. That's kind of interesting. Now, if you blow this up even more and you look at like the city of Boston, let's just say that this is the city of Boston. If you look at the streets in Boston are not straight. They're not straight like New York City. New York City is like a grid. New York City just looks like this, straight lines, straight lines, straight lines. East, west, north, south, a grid. But Massachusetts, Boston is totally different than that. Looks kind of like a hodgepodge of streets that go this way and that way and this way and that way. Why is that the case? And the whole Massachusetts thing and the town centers and all that stuff, all being equally distanced, is related. Does anybody know, or can anybody think of the relationship between a dog having to run really far forward, the ability of a hunter to be able to chase down a deer and break its neck, and the shape of the towns and counties of the East Coast United States. Does anybody have any ideas of what's tying these things in together? Why would a dog race ahead of you into the woods? How would people be able to chase down a deer? And why are the towns or the town centers in Massachusetts relatively equally distant from each other? Does anybody have any ideas? Now, obviously, everything is tied in to this chapter. So it probably has to do with our lungs and the way our lungs work, and that the way that we're able to bring in oxygen. And that is indeed the case. So what is the difference between, now I'm going to draw a horse here, but I'm drawing it with my mouse. So be a little bit kind to me. Does anybody know the difference, or what is the main difference between a human and a horse or a deer or a dog? What's the biggest difference that you guys can tell me? Alice, you're the first one on the screen. What's the biggest difference?
I'd say it's that we have 2 legs rather than 4.
So there's something up with this 2 legs thing. Now, one reason why human beings walk on 2 legs is because they have thumbs. And if you're able to walk on 2 legs, then you free up your arms so that your hands can make a system with something else in the environment, like a scissors or a pen or anything else like that, a tool. And when you link up with that system, then what you get is those emergent properties. So no doubt, one reason for human beings to be bipedal is because we can become systems with other tools. So it's the use of tools like scissors or like any other tool. And if we are free to use our hands, and then our hands and our arms create the link between me and the scissor, then obviously I become a system, and then the emergent properties and all the stuff I've been talking about. But like Alice says, maybe there's something to do with the legs, the breathing. Maybe there's something to do with the fact that we're bipedal, and all of these animals, dogs, deers, and horses are quadrupedal. And that is indeed what we're going to be talking about today. So isn't it curious that when you watch races on TV, the Boston Marathon is 26.2 miles. 26.2. But like the Kentucky Derby is not 26.2 miles, it's only 1.5 miles. I always thought that was curious. In fact, they actually even have a marathon where humans and horses compete together. So they'll start a marathon, and the humans will start first. And they'll get a head start, like a 20-minute head start. And then they'll release horses with rider, and the horses will have to catch up to the people. More often than not, the winner of the race is a man or a woman, sorry, a human being. Now, obviously, there are exceptions where some of the horses are able to catch up to some of the people. But in the last 10 years, more often than not, the man has outlasted the horse. And sometimes, just to have fun, on like the 1200 channels on Comcast is like horse racing. And I'll call my buddy Reed while he's at work, and we'll bet on horse racing on Venmo. But all of those races are only 1.5 miles long. Never seen a horse race in the United States longer than that. I never really thought of why, but now that I kind of think about that, that's curious to me. Why don't you ever see a 5-mile long horse race? That's interesting. And for that matter, let's go back to this. What's up with the state of Massachusetts and having these equal distant town centers, but very different shapes of towns? So I want to talk about that for a second. Does anybody have any hypothesis as to why the town centers would be equally distant from each other, but the shape of not only the counties and the towns, but the states themselves are these weird oblong shapes, whereas in the West, most of the shapes are more square? Seems as though these shapes here are to designate territory, so they're easily marked off as this is this state, that's this state. Where did this shape come from? And where did the town centers come from? Does anybody have any thoughts? And if you look at Boston itself, why are all the streets so terribly organized? DJ, any ideas?
As to why the town center are like equidistance.
Yeah, number one, that's the coolest thing. Why are the town centers equally distant from each other? And DJ, I'll keep going with you. If you watch a Western, what's the most popular building that you'll hear about in a Western?
I'm gonna say a saloon.
Right, so you have a saloon. So why do all Westerns focus on what happens? I think it's at 1L, but it doesn't matter. On what happens at a saloon. And then outside the saloon, DJ, what's there going to be?
I mean, like a sheriff's office, probably.
I'm talking about like you go outside the door of the saloon, you open up swinging doors, and what's right in front of you?
Isn't it usually like a road? There's like a porch and then a road.
Right, a porch and a road, and attached to the porch, what is there?
Stairs.
Correct. And attached to the, one second, so you have your saloon, you have your stairs here, and right outside that is going to be a little bit of like a wood fence, right? And the wood fence is going to be where all the horses are tied up to.
Yeah.
Okay, so why would a saloon, why would somebody make a saloon? You know, like what is the reasoning for this establishment in the first place, the saloon establishment. And it has to do a lot with this, the horse. So the reason these towns are equally distant from each other is because they're all about the same distance that a horse can sprint and then have to take a rest. So the horse would start here and it would sprint for a while. I don't know how long that is. And then the horse would have to take a rest. So they take the rope, wrap it around here, and they get the horse to just chill out a little bit. And while the horse is chilling out, they go in and have a beer. And then they get on the horse and race to the next town center. And when the horse needs to rest again, guess what's going to be there? Another saloon. So the town centers in Massachusetts are all based on animal physiology. How far can a horse gallop without having to rest? And when the horse gets exhausted and needs to sit down or at least needs to pant and relax, then the cowboy gets off, goes into the saloon, has a beer. When the cowboy is stressed, is a little bit less stressed out, and the horse is rested, then the cowboy can get back on the horse and race to the next distance that the horse would need rest. And at that distance, they created another saloon. And then slowly but surely, all the towns started to kind of become incorporated around the town centers, but the town centers were all based on the location of the saloons. Does that sound reasonable, DJ?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And now the reason why all of the roads in Boston are all crisscrossed and disorganized, unlike New York City, is because all of the roads in Boston are paved over old cow roads. Boston is a hill. All the water runs off the hill, right? Beacon Hill. So in order to get the cows water, they would have to walk the cows down the hill towards the water. So all of the streets in Boston are all based on old cow pastures and cow lanes or walking lanes. I don't know what you call them. So the actual civic structure of the streets, the equidistant nature of the townships, and the shapes of the states themselves are based on the physiology of quadrupeds. That to me is super interesting. Not only that, but I've never seen a horse race that goes longer than 1.5 miles. Why is that? I never really see, unless I watch the Olympic Games, I never really see a human race that people are interested in that's not a marathon. Yeah, sure, you get your 100-meter dash and all that stuff. And the 400 relay in the Olympic Games was one of the most amazing events I've ever seen. But there's something curious about this: horses racing short distances and men racing long distances. So I'm going to show you a real quick video. It's like 2 minutes long, I think, that talks a little bit about it. Whoops. Let's go like this. Actually, I don't think I'm going to do that. I think I'm just going to go like this. Otherwise, everything's going to get erased. So let's just explain it to you. Let's take a look at this. Now, there's a number of different mechanisms that limit a horse from running a long distance. Now, one of them has to do with temperature. Another one has to do with probably central nervous system fatigue and all sorts of other causes. But we're going to talk about one that has to do with the legs. So and more importantly, the front legs. And we'll put in a picture here of a human being. So not only does a human being have thumbs, and because they have thumbs, they can manipulate the environment. So you want to free up these arms to be able to link up and make a tool, or to use a tool. And if you use the tool, then you get those emergent properties of hold water ability. If I didn't have a cup here, because my hands have slits in them between the fingers, I wouldn't be able to hold any liquid or water. But if you give me a vessel that doesn't have any holes in it, then I automatically get that ability to hold water by linking up with some tool in the environment. Or if you give me a scissors, I have cut ability. Or if you give me a binoculars, I have see far distance away ability. Or if you give me a chair, I have sit ability. And all of these abilities are emergent due to whatever tool that I'm linked up with. So the ability to use my arms is an incredible adaptation that makes human beings different than other animals. Other animals don't understand this. Use a tool in the environment to have these emergent properties. We're the only animal that does that. Maybe there are some apes that do that. But we have so little capability on our own bodies. In fact, like if you put me in a room with any other animal, most likely that other animal is more efficient than me. I can't keep myself warm. I cannot. Isn't it weird that all other animals can poop and don't need toilet paper? But human beings can't even perform the simple function of defecating without an external tool. If we're the highest animal on the food chain, don't you think that we should be able to like poop without toilet paper? Like a dog can just poop and it's done. That's kind of interesting to me. Why would we be the top animal on the food chain and not be able to, get rid of our waste effectively? In fact, if you think about it, human beings can't keep themselves warm. They can't protect their own feet. I can't really do anything online except for scratch and brush my teeth. But even then, I guess I need a toothbrush to brush my teeth. So I can't even keep my teeth clean. The only thing I can do is scratch myself. Everything else in a human being, we need another tool to do. But animals don't need tools. So one advantage of these arms, obviously, is that we can use tools. That's a huge advantage. But another advantage of using only two legs to walk is this. When a horse hits the ground, it hits the ground with a force. But Newton's law says that there's an equal and opposite reaction. So not only does the hoof hit the ground, but the ground pushes back up through the leg. And you notice this leg is super straight. So all the force is going to be transferred, boom, back up into this direction here. And same thing, this hoof is going to hit the ground, and there's going to be another big, huge push of force. Now this horse weighs a lot. So the ground reaction force. This is the force due to the horse's body weight. This is the body weight force, which is mass times acceleration. But then the force that goes upwards is going to be the ground reaction force. The force due to the ground, because of Newton's laws, the equal and opposite force to body weight. Now, the force of body weight is going to be pretty large. Therefore, the ground reaction force is going to be pretty large. And then what you have is you have the whole upper body here of the horse. And in the upper body of the horse is, I can't draw the anatomy, but I'm sure there's the heart, but you also have the lungs of the horse. So when the hoof hits the ground and then the ground pushes back up at the hoof, this leg striking the ground makes a physical restriction to the lungs. And every time the hoof hits the ground, the leg jams upward into this chest cavity and forces an expiration. So every time the front legs of the horse hit the ground, it physically slams into the lungs and forces the horse to breathe out. So a horse is limited to a 1-to-1 breath to step ratio. Every time the horse hits the ground, the front limbs force an expiration. It increases the pressure on the upper cavity. It physically pushes the lungs and forces the horse to breathe out. Same thing with the deer, same thing with the dog, same thing with a cow. So a horse is limited aerobically. So as the horse needs more and more oxygen, it can't deliver oxygen faster. When I walk, though, I can walk and take, say, for instance, every 5 steps I can take 2 breaths. But then I can switch that to every 3 steps I take when I'm running, I can take 3 breaths. And then at some point, you can take faster and faster breaths. There's nothing physically connecting my legs to my breathing ability. There's nothing limiting that. So as human beings need to deliver more and more oxygen to their body, what they do is they just change the ventilation rate. So they can pull in more oxygen. Now, I don't want to necessarily have such a high breathing rate because that requires energy. So if I can deliver enough oxygen while I'm walking, then I can get away with taking more steps and less breaths. But if I need to deliver more oxygen, then a human can acutely change their ventilation rate so that they can pull more oxygen into the system. So what would happen is the horses would run for a while and have to rest. And then they go make a saloon there, and then they'd run for a while and have to rest, and run for a while and have to rest, and run for a while and have to rest. And all of a sudden, the townships of the states started to develop. And then as you get further and further out, the towns get a little further away. As you move towards the west, what happens is the states start to get a little bit more uniform in shape until you get to the coast. And now this aerobic endurance capacity of horses and humans starts to design the civics of a new nation. To me, that's pretty amazing. So the physiology of human beings makes it so that we are probably the most efficient endurance animals on the planet. And that's pretty much what this chapter talks about. It's going to talk about the changes in the physiology of human beings due to endurance training, or due to training the body to use sugars and oxygen for fuel. And unlike quadrupedal animals, we can become more and more effective as the distances increase, as long as we have calories and the lung and cardiovascular capacity to deal with it. Anybody have any questions about that? Any comments? All right. So let's take a look now. Let's clear all of this stuff. Don't save. Now let's get to this lecture. So chapter 11 talks about adaptations to aerobic and anaerobic training. So let's just talk about the difference between those. Aerobic training and aerobic training. So aerobic training, they're talking about cycling, running, swimming, bouts of activity that are going to last for a longer period of time, that are repetitive. Anaerobic training, they're talking about sprint training, or like high intensity interval training. And what are the adaptations to each of these? Most of the chapter talks about aerobic adaptations. The last 9 pages of the chapter talk about anaerobic training. There are acute adaptations. Acute means like what happens over the course of a short period of time. And the acute adaptations to aerobics, if I do aerobic exercise, what are the physiological changes that happen over a short period of time? And we were talking about that breath to step ratio. So those are typically that's what I would talk about, like the fact that we can take 5 breaths for every 2 steps, or we can change to 3 breaths for every 1 step, or we can adjust our breathing ratio. We can adjust our ventilation. When you do aerobic exercise, obviously an acute change would be an increase in heart rate, right? As soon as I start exercising, my heart rate goes up. There's an increase in breathing rate. So these are all acute changes to exercise. I think that this chapter really is focusing on the long-term or chronic adaptations to aerobic training. So if I do 2 months of training or 3 months of training, what are the long-term changes at my lungs? What are the long-term changes to the heart? What are the long-term changes to other areas in my body based on this aerobic training? And then what are the benefits of sprint training, or bursts of training anywhere between 6 to 30 seconds? 6 to 30 seconds. Now, if I'm training with the aerobic exercises, then here I'm really training my slow glycolysis, the ability to use sugars and oxygen to create fuel. And here with the sprint training, I'm working my fast glycolysis. So my ability to use pyruvate and shuttle out lactic acid to maintain fuel. So really what you're doing is training different bioenergetic systems here. And that's what this chapter talks about. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt at any time. The chapter starts with a discussion of adaptations to aerobic training. And then the last section talks about anaerobic training. And within that anaerobic training, high intensity interval training and cross training is broken down. The beginning of the chapter talks about changes to your cardiorespiratory endurance. And we should talk a little bit about the different types of endurance. One is muscular endurance. And what muscular endurance refers to, and we already talked about this before, you have strength, and we defined strength as the maximal contraction that a muscle group can deliver. So it's a 1 RM max pretty much. Muscular strength refers to the body's ability to do a maximum contraction. Muscular endurance is different. And muscular endurance is different than cardiorespiratory endurance. What muscular endurance refers to is the ability for a muscle to do repetitive motions. Remember when I said, if you did a push-up test, repetition, or if you did a curl-up test, or if you did dips, or even if you ran a 100-meter long race, you're not doing one maximum contraction. If I'm doing 25 dips or 25 pull-ups or 30 sit-ups, or if I'm running a 100-meter dash, I'm taking many different steps. I'm repeating a motion over and over and over. Muscular strength is an indicator of how much you can lift one time at maximum. And muscular endurance refers to the ability for the muscle to do repetitive movements. Cardiorespiratory endurance refers to something totally different. Cardiorespiratory endurance has to do with how your heart and your lungs are able to bring oxygen and fuel to the body. And cardiorespiratory endurance has to do with many different systems: the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the muscle system, bioenergetics. So now you have this multi-system thing. So not only are we talking about systems dynamics here, but now you have multiple systems that are connected to each other. And what is the emergent property of all of these systems connected to each other? All right, now we have something that's pretty profound. The ability for a body to sustain movement for a long period of time, which is one of the things that defines human beings and separates us from quadrupedal animals, that we have cardiorespiratory endurance capacity. So obviously, if I do exercise and I do cycling and running, I can increase the ability for my body to utilize oxygen. And one way to measure someone's ability to perform endurance training is by looking at their Vo2 Max. Vo2 Max is the volume, and this means per minute, of oxygen that I consume at the maximal level. So if I'm doing a maximum effort on a treadmill, Bruce treadmill protocol, some individuals are going to be able to use more oxygen than others because their lungs are bigger, their heart is more effective, they have more vascularization, less damage to peripheral capillaries. And they're able to pull more oxygen in. So with endurance training, at maximal exercise, there's an increase in the ability to utilize oxygen. Now, if you're considering submaximal efforts, endurance training results in a lower heart rate. It's because your heart is more effective. So if it's more effective, it doesn't have to beat as much. And with endurance training, you can certainly increase Vo2 max. It doesn't increase forever. And in fact, if you take a look at the slope of these lines here, so you have pre-training, this is the top Vo2 max that this individual could get to, is here. You notice there's a plateau here. Let's change the color. There's a plateau in the blue. So this pre-trained individual started at 6 kilometers per hour. And at 6 kilometers per hour, they were spending 20 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Now, notice that says per kilogram. So if an individual weighs more, they're going to be breathing more oxygen. So the size of the individual, the size of their musculature, or the need for more oxygen to get to the muscles is a factor. And also the size of the lungs allows for more oxygen to be processed. In any event, this individual who is working at 6 kilometers per hour is spending a particular amount of oxygen. Increase the treadmill speed to 7, they use more oxygen, right? And keep increasing more oxygen until finally, when you get to about this speed here, this person can no longer bring in more oxygen. And because of that, their oxygen capacity will plateau and they've reached their Vo2 max. Now, this here is an indicator of cardiorespiratory endurance. Typically, highly trained athletes will have a much higher Vo2 max than an individual who isn't trained. So this person then went through a bout of 6 months of endurance training. And you notice after training, they're able to get to higher treadmill speeds before their max and utilize more oxygen. So at first they're using 45 milliliters per kilogram at their max, and now they're able to function at 57 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Now you'll notice the slope of these graphs from this point all the way to this point, they're both the same. So the cost of the exercise or the rate at which oxygen is needed is the same for both bouts of exercise. But after training, they're able to just pull more oxygen in. They're able to get to a higher Vo2 max. And because of that, they're able to continue onto the treadmill at higher velocities and improve their sport performance. So although the cost of the exercise won't change with the training, the ability to pull in more oxygen and therefore continue in that bout of training will certainly improve.
Vo2 max is the physiologist's term for fitness. It reflects the maximal rate at which oxygen can flux from the environment through the lungs, pumped around by the heart, and out diffusing into the mitochondria, where it can be utilized to make energy, with oxygen as the final common pathway. So we think of people who have the higher Vo2 max have a greater fitness. So endurance athletes, for example, have a much bigger Vo2 max than a non-athlete. Of course, it depends on what kind of race we're talking about, but races like 5,000 meters, which last somewhere around 15 minutes or so, typically are run at Vo2 max. So an athlete with a Vo2 max of, say, 70 mLs per kg per minute will be able to run much faster than a sedentary person with only 35 mLs per kg per minute. Notice that I've scaled it per kilogram body weight. That's important because actually total oxygen uptake is a function of body size. So bigger people will have bigger engines and be able to have more oxygen uptake. But you still got to move that big body uphill. So if you scale it to body mass, and there are some people who would argue perhaps you should scale it to a different number, perhaps lean body mass or even a different ordinal of body mass. Then it's a better way of comparing individuals across ages, sexes, and things like that.
Second.
Vo2 max is the physiology.
So with aerobic training, there are many different cardiovascular changes to the heart and to the blood vessels, or not just to the blood vessels, but the way that oxygen is distributed from the heart into the lungs, into the vascular system. So the changes that occur are in heart size. And I'll just summarize the changes real quick. The left ventricular diameter and muscle wall thickness increases. The ability for the body to pull in blood, or the ability for the heart to draw in blood and also constrict strong enough to get rid of all the blood that's in the left ventricle, improves. Heart rate decreases with training. Cardiac output, or the ability for my heart to put out blood, increases. Cardiac output is the product or multiplication of stroke volume and heart rate, and also the ability for your oxygen to diffuse between the lungs and the blood vessels. Also, blood flow increases. The amount of blood actually increases with aerobic training. For individuals who are hypertensive, there can be reductions in systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure, and the overall blood volume increases. And that happens because of increases in proteins and plasma volume. And if the blood volume increases, like if I take syrup and I add water to it, the volume of the mixture will increase, but the viscosity or the thickness of the mixture will decrease. So there's an increase in blood volume that makes the blood less thick and better able to flow into little teeny capillaries. And that's really the whole entire chapter. So the cardiovascular system transports oxygen in and out of the lungs, in and out of the body. And the way it does it, or the ability to use oxygen, my body's maximal ability to use oxygen is based on a couple of things. First of all, my stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood for every heartbeat that I can squeeze out of my heart. The amount of oxygen, therefore, that I can get into my body has to do with the size and strength of my heart and the number of beats that the heart makes. And if I have no ability, this is my alveoli and my veins, if there's no ability to diffuse oxygen across this membrane, and then it doesn't matter how much blood I'm squirting out of my heart. If I can't transfer the oxygen and carbon dioxide, then it really can't have any diffusion. So I won't have any exchange of gases. So the ability for your gases to go across the membranes and my cardiac output is the equation that you can use to model how your body is utilizing oxygen. At Vo2 Max, or at very high endurance efforts, Vo2 Max is a combination of increased stroke volume. Typically, my heart rate will max out, and there'll also be an increase in the ability to diffuse oxygen across membranes. So with aerobic training that utilizes oxygen, which is cycling, running, rowing, stuff like that, heart size increases. This means left ventricular volume. So just to make it, I guess this is not what everything looks like. But you have your heart. This is your atrium, the atria up here. Let's change this color. You have your right atria. You have your right ventricle. This is your left atria and your left ventricle. The vena cava comes in here. This blood goes to the lungs. Then the blood from the lungs comes into the left atria, and then the blood from the left ventricle goes to the body. So blood's flowing this way to the lungs and this way to the body. And then this is just a model. This is not what it looks like. So in this process, most of the chapter is going to talk about the improvements to the left ventricle, or the changes to the left ventricle, because it's the left ventricle that fires to squirt the blood through the aorta to get to the body. So most of the adaptation that the chapter talks about is with this physiological portion of the heart. And it says, with training, the left ventricular volume increases. So the volume within this chamber increases. When I increase my pulse rate past a particular amount, it stresses the heart, just like if you're exercising your skeletal muscle. If I increase the stresses on any muscle, it's going to cause hypertrophy, growth. And with that hypertrophy, the heart is not only going to be bigger here, but it also has a thicker wall, a thicker contractile ability, or a stronger contractile ability. So it'll be able to squeeze out more blood because the muscle is stronger than it normally was. Furthermore, there's also an increase in plasma volume. So what happens is the blood is two different kinds of things. You have your red blood cells And you also have your blood plasma. Blood plasma is like just fluid, proteins and fluid. And with exercise, this plasma volume increases. This volume increases. So now there's even more fluid in the blood. And what happens is when more fluid is forced into the left ventricle, the fluid itself actually creates pressure on the walls of the ventricle that push the ventricle open more, like an elastic band. It stretches the left ventricle. If that's the case, then there's increased volume in the left ventricle. And that what that does is expands the musculature of the left ventricle and like pushes it open so you can get more blood in. And that stretches all of the tissue. So not only is the heart going to be able to contract because it's a muscle, but the stretch of all of the volume pushing on the walls of the ventricle are going to make it so that there's an elastic recoil of the heart, which allows the heart to actually push even more. This is end diastolic volume. So you have two things. You have the systolic, here, let's change this. You have systolic, and you have diastolic. Diastolic. So what do these refer to? Well, your heart is doing, has two different like phases to it. Obviously, first we know that the heart is going to contract. The heart muscle is going to contract, boom, and squeeze in. And that's going to create a very high pressure situation in this chamber. There's a high pressure, things are going to go from a high pressure to a low pressure. So the blood is going to squirt out of the heart, out of the left ventricle, into the aorta and into the body. So systole or systolic pressure, or during systole, the heart is contracting. During diastolic pressure or diastole is when the heart relaxes. Now you can kind of think of it as a pressure gradient. So if the pressure in the heart is very high, because the heart is contracting during systolic blood pressure, then the pressure of the heart is much higher than the pressure of the blood in the veins. And because of that, the blood is going to go from a high to a low pressure, high to low pressure. So the blood is going to go from the heart to the veins. But when the heart relaxes, it actually reduces pressure in the heart, and the heart becomes super relaxed, and the blood now has a higher pressure in the veins and the vena cava than it does in the heart. So then the blood is going to flow from the vein into the heart. Systole is when the heart is contracting, and diastole is when the heart is relaxing. So if there's a bigger plasma volume, and that plasma volume is pushing the left ventricle open, that means there's going to be an increased volume of blood in the heart at the end of the heart relaxing. And if the heart can relax even more and make an even greater change or drop in pressure, then you'll pull in even more blood to the heart. Because of that, when the heart contracts, there'll be a greater volume of blood being pushed into the aorta during the heart's contraction. It's called the volume loading effect. The plasma volume forcing the left ventricle open to increase the amount of blood that the ventricle can take. But then the elastic potential of the heart wall and the contractility of that left ventricle muscle is going to push more and more blood out. So this is one adaptation that occurs. increased blood plasma volume, increased left ventricle volume, increased end diastolic volume, increased stroke volume. But you'll notice, I believe this is the next slide. And this is a slide that kind of shows this this occurring. So this is the left ventricle internal diameter. So this is the volume of the left ventricle itself. And this is looking at runners, cyclists, and strength athletes. Now, with strength athletes, they need to be able to get blood out of the heart very quickly so that they can provide muscles with oxygen. And you'll know the mean wall thickness for strength athletes increases almost the same as runners. So for strength athletes, the ability for the muscles to contract, the mean wall thickness, is very important. For endurance athletes, you'll notice that the left ventricular internal diameter is a little bit higher here for both of these endurance athletes than it is for the resistance training athlete. And this is showing you that for your runners and cyclists, not only is the contractile strength important, but the ability to pull in more blood becomes even more relevant. This is left ventricular mass, showing that with all training, the size and the strength of the heart increases. But with endurance training, it happens to a greater extent. So some of the cardiovascular changes that occur with endurance training is the thickness of the heart increases, the mass of the left ventricle increases, and the volume of blood that's able to fill the left ventricle also increases. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt at any time. So the stroke volume increases after training. But what's curious, though, is cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. So there's an increase in stroke volume during rest, during submaximal, and during maximal exercise. And we talked about that there's an increase in the plasma volume, which forces more blood into the heart as the heart is relaxing. And that's called an increased preload. But you'll notice that the heart rate drops with the training. So cardiac output increases with training. The ability for my heart to push out blood increases, but heart rate actually goes down. So most of the changes in regards to cardiac output have to be through either increases in stroke volume, or remember, there's an equation. Let me go back here. There's this equation here. It's stroke volume, Vo2 max, or cardiac output, is equal to stroke volume, right? Stroke volume, which is here, and heart rate, which is here. And this difference between the pressures in my alveoli and my venules of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So you notice with exercise, this heart rate goes down. So our improvements in Vo2 max then have to be because of improvements in stroke volume or the ability for my body to exchange oxygen more effectively. So stroke volume increases after training. That has to do with the plasma volume, the increase in the left ventricle diameter and strength, and the ability for me to preload my heart with more blood prior to the contraction. But you'll notice that the resting and submaximal heart rate go down. So cardiac output goes up, but heart rate goes down. Now, imagine if your heart was beating, I don't know, 120 beats per minute, right? You're exercising, you're spending 120 beats per minute. And sometimes you're even at like 180 beats per minute if you're at maximal heart rate. So 180 beats per minute, 180 beats. 180 beats per minute, but there's only 60 seconds in a minute. So that means that if I have 180 beats per minute, then each beat lasts about 0.3 seconds. That was 0.3 seconds, not 1/1000, it's 1/1. So if your heartbeat is lasting only 0.3 of a second, how much blood can you actually fill in the heart in that small amount of time? And if your heart is beating faster, 190 beats per minute, 200 beats per minute, there's just not enough time for the blood to fill the heart during each heartbeat. So another adaptation is that the heart rate actually decreases. That allows more time for blood to fill the heart. And that's going to make it so that the end volume of blood in the heart after the heart is relaxing increases. So the heart is like a vacuum. The way that a vacuum cleaner works is that the machine creates a low pressure, a pressure inside the vacuum cleaner that is lower than the pressure in the room. And because of that, what happens is the vacuum sucks in the air. It's very similar, like if you had a window. If I have a window, and it's during the summertime, and inside is the AC. I got the AC going. It's nice and cool inside. But outside is really hot. The trees, everything is 100 degrees outside. So if I open the window and it's cold inside and it's hot outside, where does the air go? Does the cold air go outside, or does the hot air come inside? Usually things go from a high to a low pressure, high to low. And PV, pressure times volume, is equal to nRT. So volume and pressure are directly related to temperature. So increased temperature equals increased pressure. And things go from a high to low pressure. So if this is a high temperature outside, 90 degrees, 90 degrees outside, and it's only 70 degrees inside because I got the AC on. When I open this window, things are going to go from a high to a low pressure, from a high temperature to a low temperature, from a high temperature to a low pressure. So the hot air is going to rush inside, right? And it's going to make it so that your room is warmer. But if the opposite is true, if it's really warm inside and cold outside when I open the window, then the hot air is going to go in the opposite direction, and your heart works the same way. During diastole, what I want to do is create a very low pressure. During systole, when the heart contracts, the muscle of the heart itself increases the pressure inside the heart. And things go from a high to a low pressure. So when the heart contracts, everything squirts out of the heart. With training, though, what can happen is the heart can relax even further during diastole. It can drop the pressure down even more. And because of that, what happens is the heart can draw in even more stroke volume. So one of the adaptations is that the heart can relax further. And that happens because of changes to parasympathetic nervous system activity. Not only that, but the left ventricular mass also increases, which is pretty much saying that the muscle of the heart goes through hypertrophy. It gets stronger. And if the muscle is stronger, it can force more blood out because the contraction is stronger. Now, if you look at older populations, these adaptations will drop. But for the most part, these increases in the dimensions of the heart allow for more oxygen to be delivered to the tissues. Now, this is an individual who is training at various treadmill speeds. And you'll notice that the stroke volume in milliliters per beat doesn't even matter what speed they're training at. If they train at 5 kilometers per hour, after training, they're still able to get more blood out of the heart. So clearly here, the increase in stroke volume is a positive adaptation to aerobic training. Most of this stroke volume, though, remember, most of the cardiac output changes, rather, are going to be because of this stroke volume increase and changes at the arterial venous level, as opposed to increases in heart rate. So you'll notice here that for an untrained individual, the stroke volume at rest is 50 to 70 milliliters per beat. And then for a trained individual, obviously these numbers are going up. This is your maximum stroke volume. And highly trained individuals obviously can get more than 2 to 3 times the amount of blood to exit the heart than somebody who's not trained. Major adaptation to aerobic training. And most of this improvements in cardiac output, remember cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. So if the cardiac output is increasing, but the heart rate is decreasing, then like we just said, most of the improvements are going to be because of increases in stroke volume. Now, on Wednesday, what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about heart rate and blood pressure and starting your heart rate and blood pressure left. Now, let's see. If I say, for instance, have 60 beats per minute, 60 beats per minute, multiply by 60 minutes, multiply by 24 hours in a day. My heart, if I'm just resting, sitting here, is going to beat 86,400 times a day. Multiply that by 365. Multiply that by, right now, I'm 44. Like, I don't even know what that math is. So let's divide that by 44. Every year, my heart is going to beat 31,536 times. Right? If I can reduce that by 1 beat per minute per week of training, imagine how many heart rates or how many heartbeats I would save over the course of my heart life. That's what your lab is all about. Through endurance training or aerobic training, we're able to reduce our heart rate. And it's on average about a beat per minute per week of training. What would that do in terms of our overall heart health over the course of our lifetime? And how many heartbeats would you save if we just could reduce our resting heart rate through exercise, aerobic training? That's what your lab is all about. So what we're going to do on Wednesday is I'll teach you how to do the heart rate and blood pressure. And what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at your resting heart rate. And then the lab write-up, the heart rate lab write-up, will have this little mathematical experiment that will give you information that will tell you, on average, how many heartbeats you'd save. And then you're going to use that information to write up a good discussion. Remember, we talked about parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. Para, the P goes down, right? So there's an increased activity that gets the heart to relax with aerobic training. Again, that's important because if the heart relaxes and it doesn't beat as forcefully or with as much frequency, then what you're doing is you're increasing the time of diastolic pressure. And if there's more time, then more blood can get pulled into the heart. And because there's an increase in parasympathetic activity, the left ventricle can relax more during diastole, which can pull more blood into the actual heart. So resting heart rate decreases, submaximal heart rate decreases, but maximum heart rate doesn't really change too much. Remember, max heart rate is 220 minus your age. And there are other actually better equations now, but we've all kind of seen this equation. So this maximum heart rate doesn't really change too much with aerobic training. So max heart rate is 220 minus the age. Then they had another individual who was exercising at various exercise levels. So treadmill speed increases. And you'll see pre-training at this particular treadmill speed, he had a heart rate of 78. And then after the 6 months of training, they did the same bout of exercise at each of these intensities. And you'll notice that after training, there was a significant reduction in heart rate, even more so at higher intensities. So stroke volume increases, heart rate decreases, overall cardiac output can actually sort of stay the same or increase a bit. We also talked, this is very similar to that oxygen consumption graph, where you have at the beginning, you have rest. So there's a certain heart rate needed. And then as the exercise intensity increases, the heart rate is going to have to increase. The Vo2 Max is going to have to increase to pull more oxygen to the tissues. until there's a plateau effect here. Now, at any particular intensity of exercise, the heart is going to have to beat in order to deliver the appropriate amount of oxygen. And typically what will happen is, let's say I have a graph that looks like this, where this is heart rate here. And on the x-axis is intensity. I'll just draw it with an I. At rest, the heart rate will only be a particular rate so that it can provide that energy at rest, but then I exercise, and then the heart rate will plateau because I've achieved the appropriate amount of oxygen that I need for that exercise. But if I increase the intensity of the exercise, my heart rate will go up until it plateaus, and then I increase the exercise intensity again, and then eventually my heart rate will plateau. So your heart at given intensity levels will have to increase its contractibility so that it can deliver more blood to the system. So here you have a particular exercise bout. This is about 200 beats per minute. 220 minus age, let's say I'm 40, is at about 180. So this is a maximum exercise effort here because of the value of heart rate per minute. So this individual is exercising. There's an increase in the heart rate to make sure that I get the blood to the muscles, and then eventually I can't beat any faster. I can't get any more oxygen. My heart rate plateaus, my Vo2 Max will plateau, and then I finish the exercise. And although when the exercise is over, I don't need to have all of this excess oxygen here. In pre-training, it'll take a lot longer for this individual to get back to the resting oxygen level. And an individual who is trained will be able to get back to their resting heart rate level much faster than an individual who is not trained. So your recovery heart rate and the ability for your heart to recover from exercise improves. So the heart rate and the stroke volume interaction is, as heart rate drops, it allows for more blood to come into the ventricle because there's more relaxation. And the interaction between heart rate and stroke volume, it's not necessarily a linear thing. It's a dynamic, fluid process that is emerging. Like, is heart rate telling stroke volume what to do? This is what this question is saying. How does this all happen? Right? It's really talking about this dynamic systems thing. Does the decrease in heart rate cause the increase in stroke volume, or does the increase in stroke volume cause a decrease in heart rate? How do they interact? Really, this question here is saying, which one is in charge? Which one has the brain? Is it the heart rate that has the brain? Is it the stroke volume that has the brain? Or are they a system? I would argue that rather than how does this happen, what I would say is that emerges. It emerges because, remember, our very first slide, emergent. Our very first slide, if I go all the way back there, right here, it's not one system acting alone. It's a multi-system adaptation. That's another word for saying this stuff is all emergent. All of the little pieces of the system interacting together, like we watched last week, the little teeny parts all interacting together, they make something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And the emergent property of all of these things occurring, that's what we're talking about, right? That's how your heart rate and stroke volume interact, through the emergence of your cardiovascular system functioning. Your recovery heart rate is faster. Your cardiac output, right? It says training creates little to no change at rest or submaximal exercise. Cardiac output is the product of heart rate equals heart rate times stroke volume. And the reason that the cardiac output doesn't go up specifically at submaximal exercise, that cardiac output doesn't go up is because although the stroke volume will increase, the heart rate will decrease and they'll kind of cancel each other out. So the cardiac output stays the same, but you have much less intensity in terms of the heart's responsibility. It's not contracting as much. But at maximal effort, the cardiac output increases mostly due to the strength and the size of the heart. This is showing same thing at various intensities of exercise. An individual's cardiac output will eventually increase after training, mostly due to your stroke volume and your arterial differences and differences between the vascular system. And some of those changes to the vascular system are increases in capillarization. So not all of the capillaries that you have are used all the time. Some of the capillaries remain dormant until you're working at high enough intensity. And then there's increased utilization of fine, teeny capillaries. And there's also an increase in the growth of capillaries. So if you look at each muscle fiber and you look at the perfusion of capillaries around that fiber, after aerobic training, each fiber will have more capillaries surrounding it so that oxygen and fuel can get to those muscles, can get to the mitochondria. So not only is there changes to the heart itself, but there's changes to the blood flow structure itself. There's also a redirection of blood flow. So your body wants to use blood for a couple of different things. This is super dummied down, but it's to digest or to move around and use your limbs. So right now I'm just sitting here, I'm not doing anything. Probably had food from my dinner. Still in my gastrointestinal tract. So there's a good amount of blood flow into my stomach, my intestines, probably a good amount of blood flow into my brain right now because I'm thinking and talking and stuff. And there's probably not a lot of blood flow into my musculature, my arms and legs right now. At least there's reduced blood flow in my arms and legs. But when I exercise and I do aerobic training, your flow of blood becomes more effective. A good warm-up, my athletes do a 5-minute warm-up. They usually get out of school, they're in the car, they're digesting all of their food, and then they get into the gym and they need to get all of the blood out of their stomach and intestines, and they needed to get into their arms, into their muscles, so that they can have fuel. And with exercise, there is a better distribution of blood to the arms and legs. Not only that, but there's an increase in blood volume. Now, if I increase the amount of blood capillaries that are being used, you could think that that's going to make so much more surface area for blood to have to travel through the body. And if I don't have more blood, or that blood is very viscous, then the blood forcing through these capillaries, it's going to be very difficult. These capillaries are small. It's like forcing, olive oil through a teeny straw. There's just only so much blood you can get through the capillaries if the blood is thick. So the increase in blood volume itself comes from plasma, makes the blood more watery, and the watery blood can squirt through the capillaries. But remember, we also said that if there's an increase in blood volume, it increases the systolic, it increases the left ventricular volume, right? Internal diameter. And that also increases the stretchiness of the muscular tissue itself. So that's going to help result in a greater amount of blood forced through the heart, a greater stroke volume. So there are changes that happen not only to the blood vessels and the capillarization, but where the blood vessels or where blood is being distributed, and also the actual total amount of blood. And this is showing you like a change in capillaries between well-trained individuals. So if you look at capillaries per millimeter squared for an individual who is well-trained versus untrained, obviously more capillaries compared. A greater capillary to fiber ratio. In regards to blood pressure at submaximal intensities, submaximal efforts, not running as fast, a submaximal effort, I guess for definition, is an effort that is not designed to get your heart rate to go 220 minus your age. That's really what a submaximal effort is. A maximal effort would mean the heart rate gets to your heart rate max. So a submaximal effort is designed, or is an exercise designed such that your heart rate will not go to 220 minus your age. So at any given intensity that's not maximum, especially for individuals who are hypertensive, who have high blood pressure, if they do aerobic training, there will be reductions in blood pressure at any exercise intensity or resting exercise. During exercise, though, it's a little bit different. What you really want is your systolic blood pressure to go up a little bit, right? Systole is when your heart is contracting. So if your heart contracts harder with more force, it's going to force more blood into the aorta and into the vessels, into the arteries. And that what that's going to do is that's going to increase the pressure. So you have an artery like this, and you have blood flowing through the artery. And that blood, what it's doing is it's pushing on the outer walls of the blood vessel, opening the blood vessel up. And that's what blood pressure is. That's what you're measuring blood pressure. We'll talk about this on Wednesday. When the heart pumps, it's forcing blood into these blood vessels. And the blood vessels are forced to expand. It's like if you have a garden hose and you turn the hose on, then the hose goes from flat and expands. And the more you turn the garden hose on, the more the blood pressure or the pressure is going to push the hose outwards. So with exercise, with trained individuals, their systolic blood pressure is going to go up slightly. What that means is the heart is beating harder, forcing blood out of it more intensely and opening up those arteries. In contrast, the diastolic blood pressure actually decreases. And what that does is Remember, things go from a high to a low pressure. High to low pressure. So if the heart can relax even more than normal, it's going to create an even greater low pressure in the heart compared to the vena cava or compared to the chamber before it. And that's going to allow the heart to relax more and make a greater vacuum and suck more blood into the heart. So with training, blood pressure will go down for individuals who are hypertensive. But for those who are trained, you could even see systolic blood pressure increase at maximal intensity, which is an adaptation designed to get more blood out of the heart. And during the relaxation phase, the diastolic pressure will reduce even more. In regards to the total volume of blood, the volume of blood increases very quickly because water is released from the kidneys, antidiuretic hormone. The kidneys suck up the water, and then rather than the kidneys getting rid of the water in the urine, the kidneys put the water back into the blood plasma and make the volume of the blood increase. There's also an increase in albumin and other proteins. What that does is it makes it so that the blood is less thick. There's a greater volume of blood cells, so there's more opportunity to hold on to oxygen, even though the overall hematocrit level may decrease. There's still an increase in the red blood cell number volume, but the percentage of red blood cells within the volume actually decreases a little bit, and I'll show you why. That's all designed to reduce the viscosity of the blood so that the blood can get into the very, very, very teeny capillaries at the muscular level. And also, if there's an increase in blood volume, more blood will be pushed into the left ventricle. And if that's the case, it helps to expand the diameter of the left ventricle, the stretchiness of the contractile material, and result in an even greater stroke volume. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. So pre-training, your blood volume, let's say in this example, is 5 liters. And after training, the blood volume is 5.7 liters. So there's clearly an increase in blood volume here. And you'll notice in terms of red blood cells, training will help increase the number of red blood cells. So you're going from 2.2 liters to 2.4 liters. So there's an increase in red blood cells. But there's a greater increase in the plasma volume. And the plasma volume change is what's really contributing to this increase in total blood volume. But you'll notice that the percentage of red blood cells actually goes down, the hematocrit level. This thing is blocked by the word font, but it says 44. So 44% hematocrit versus 42% hematocrit. Well, for trained individuals, this 2.4 liters of red blood cells is plenty to be able to accommodate what this athlete needs. So they won't get into a state of low blood cells or deoxygenation. And the increase in plasma volume reduces the viscosity of the blood enough to make it so that the blood can flow more freely, and it can increase the size of the left ventricle. And those are pretty much the adaptations that the book talks about in regards to the cardiovascular system. And now the book is going to talk about changes to the respiratory system. We already talked in the beginning about acute changes to the respiratory system. The acute changes to your aerobic training are that we can change our breath to step ratio, unlike horses and quadrupedal animals can. That's a pretty awesome adaptation that humans have developed, breath to step. Makes us much more effective. And I would say probably at first, a lot of the changes were all cardiorespiratory, cardiovascular changes. But then as our animal being continued to evolve, we needed to have more adaptations. So all of a sudden, maybe those individuals who are able to walk on 2 feet are able to change their pulmonary frequency, their ability to breathe. So maybe it's not the case that the thumbs are the only reason why we got off 4 feet. Maybe it has a lot to do with this pulmonary ventilation. At any submaximal intensity, which is resting, walking, typically there's going to be a reduction in the breaths taken per minute, because with aerobic training, there is increased lung capacity. There's an increased tidal volume, which means that the lungs can pull in more oxygen. Now, it's not because the lungs are getting bigger. It's because the musculature around the lungs are better. It's because the frequency of breathing increases. But unlike the heart that can go through hypertrophy, the lungs are not a muscle. They're an organ. So they're not going to get bigger. They're not going to change size. What will happen though is my diaphragm can get stronger. My intercostal muscles will get stronger. I'll be able to breathe more times per minute, change my breath to step ratio. So pulmonary ventilation can increase for sure. Pulmonary diffusion is the ability for my lungs to, and my ability for blood to actually go through the tissue itself. For an individual who is highly arteriosclerotic or is emphysematic, the ability for oxygen and blood to actually just travel through the cardiovascular system is going to be much more difficult. Also, the change in the concentration of oxygen from my arteries to my veins gets bigger. Remember, we said things go from a high to a low pressure, a high to a low pressure. So if there's a high concentration of oxygen in my arteries and a low concentration in my veins, then the blood is going to flow from the arteries to the veins. And if there's a greater pressure difference, it's going to result in greater extraction and flow of blood throughout that system. So with exercise training, the arterial venous oxygen difference becomes bigger, and therefore the exchange between carbon dioxide and oxygen becomes more effective. Those are changes at the respiratory level. The next slide talks about changes to the muscle. We're talking about aerobic training, which is not power training. And at low intensity exercises is where your type 1 muscle fiber types are going to be recruited at first. So with aerobic training, the body doesn't have to worry about hypertrophy. It doesn't have to worry about the micro damage because of the resistance training. So it's not going to try to synthesize proteins and make bigger muscles and fix the body. What it's going to do instead is it's going to increase the size and the number of the type 1 muscle fiber types. It's going to make it so that the oxygen utilization capacity of my muscles is better. So my type 1 muscle fiber types will increase in their size and density. It could be the case that some type 2 muscle fiber types switch to type 1 muscle fiber types, but the research does not suggest that happens at a very high rate, if it happens at all. It seems to happen in cats, but they don't know whether or not this morphing of type 2 to type 1 muscle fiber types happen. But there is, within those type 2 fast twitch muscle fiber types, there are actually three different kinds of muscle fiber types. And it seems as though that the type 2X muscle fiber types can adopt more oxidative properties and enzymes and behave somewhat similar to type 1 muscle fiber types. Within the muscle fiber itself, there's an increased number of capillaries, so more blood can get to the smaller portions of the muscles. Remember, Vo2 Max, in terms of your stroke volume and cardiac output, plateaus at some point, but there are still improvements in sport performance even after individuals have topped off their Vo2 Max. So it could be the case that some of these improvements in performance are now, rather than your Vo2 Max improving, could be that your capillarization or the atrial ventricular difference in oxygen concentration is more. Also, myoglobin increases. So the ability for your oxygen capacity or your blood cells to deliver oxygen becomes more effective because there's more hemoglobin and myoglobin, more opportunity for oxygen to attach to red blood cells and be delivered to the muscles. There's also an increase in the size and the number of mitochondria within the muscle fiber type. And remember, it's inside the mitochondria that the glucose or your free fatty acids or your amino acids are broken down for more ATP. So with aerobic training, there's an increase in not only the size, but the number of mitochondria. And that depends on how intense your training is. Then within the muscle, this is certain enzymes that are there to help break down glucose and sugars and create more ATP, like succinate dehydrogenase, citrate synthase. These oxidative enzymes, these molecules that are, or not molecules, they're whatever, molecules-ish that, or whatever, compounds that that make it easier to use oxygen to break down food. There's an increased number of oxidative enzymes within the muscle fibers, especially within the type 1 muscle fiber types, that allows for sugars to be utilized more effectively. And even some of these, so you'll notice in this slide right here, after about 1 to 2 months of training at maximal exercise, it seems as though there's a plateau in the change of Vo2 Max. So after 1 month, you see there's a big, huge, I can improve Vo2 Max 12%. And then after the next month, it increases another 22%. But after some point, there's a plateau in the ability for Vo2 Max to increase. At some point, my lung volume just can't expand anymore. But at the same time, you can see that with intensity training or with high endurance training, you can see that there's an improvement in sport performance, which is measured in training distance over a period of time, almost a linear period of time. Training distance continues to improve. Sport performance continues to improve in spite of the fact that your VO2 max is already plateaued out. So where are the improvements coming from now? Well, it seems as though these improvements in training distance are very similar to the graph in terms of your improvement in succinate dehydrogenase activity. So it seems as though there are improvements from a muscular level in regards to VO2 max and the ability to pull in oxygen, but at some time it's these increases in oxidative enzymes that actually is the thing that's going to really change sport performance over a long period of time. This is untrained, moderately trained, highly trained, and this is succinate dehydrogenase citrate synthase. And you'll see the more training or the more intensity or the higher the trained athlete, the more concentration of these particular enzymes that are in their bloodstream. So a good amount of this improvement in sport performance that you see further and further into their, into the timeline is, it's suggested that it is because of this improved enzyme activity. There's also a better ability for your body to take the blood lactate and process it in the liver faster so that there's less of a spike in the acidity of the blood and therefore less inflammation and reduction in cell wall integrity to the muscle fibers that are exposed to increases in high acidic blood because of this breakdown of lactate. The liver works faster to get rid of the lactate. It creates sugars faster. And that just makes it so that you're not going to get your lactate accumulation and fatigue associated with increased blood lactate and increased acidity of the blood. Says here that the respiratory exchange ratio reduces at all intensities, at absolute, at the maximum that you can exercise, and at somewhat less intensities, there's a reduction in respiratory exchange ratio with aerobic training. And we said that a respiratory exchange ratio of 1 means that that individual is spending sugars, right? And if it's less than 1, it means that they're spending fats or they're burning fats. So for a highly trained individual, their respiratory exchange ratio reduces, which means that that individual is now going to try to burn fat and save the sugars for later on in a bout of exercise. So there's an increase dependent on the burning of free fatty acids for fuel at lower intensity exercises for an individual who's trained. So with aerobic training, the best way to indicate whether or not somebody is improving their aerobic ability is to measure VO2 max. Right now, VO2 max is our best indicator of whether or not your cardio, your heart and your lungs are functioning effectively. This can increase a lot with training, but many of the increases are due to capillary density, output, enzyme activity. It's not just a one thing that increases VO2 max. It's central nervous system activity, releasing norepinephrine, releasing calcium, making the contractibility of the heart more effective. That increases the stroke volume, which increases the cardiac output, which leads to a higher VO2 max. Or it could be that your vasodilation, autoregulation, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system is more effective, which allows for autoregulation. Vasodilation allows for more blood to go to the heart, which is going to increase stroke volume, which increases cardiac output. Or it could be the case that your capillaries have increased. The number of capillaries used, the ability to break down oxygen makes it so that the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen at the alveolar and the venule level is more effective. All right, it could be the case that because I've exercised, there's less constriction, there's more vasodilation. It could be the case that maybe I'm a lifelong smoker and I have huge constriction, which is going to be which is going to affect everything all the way up. So this is a multifactorial, multi-system process. And again, it's all of these systems interacting together that allows for this improvement. It's not like the brain center increases VO2 max, or the arterioles are in charge, or this is in charge, or that. It's a system, and all of these parts are connected. So whereas you have the very first system I showed you was you have a point A and a point B, and they're only connected via this one constraint. Now you have many points. You have point A, you have point B, you have point C, you have the brain, you have the plasma, you have all sorts of different things functioning together and all connected via hormones and blood and neurons and physical things like the expansion of your stomach. And all of these are connections that constrain these systems together. And what emerges is something astounding. Now, a lot of these changes are not only due to training. Some people are going to be high responders. Some people are going to be low responders. So it could be the case that some of these responses are dictated by genetics, training status, whether or not I've trained VO2 max before, whether or not I'm continue to train, whether or not I don't train any longer. So a lot of these responses are going to be different for everybody. Individuals who are already fit, if you have an exercise experiment and you look at people who are sedentary and you look at individuals who are very, very fit, let's say you, for instance, have hyper marathoners and you're trying to look at their VO2 max. Well, these individuals are already very fit. So if you give them an exercise regimen, they're going to improve their VO2 max, but not a huge amount. Their VO2 max is already topped off. But if you had an individual who's sedentary, like myself, who doesn't really have too much capacity in my lungs, right? And then I exercised, the changes that I would experience over the course of the first 8 to 10 months would be way bigger than the changes that somebody who's already fit would have. So your training status or your improvement depends on whether or not you're trained or not. Individuals who are sedentary are going to have much greater changes than individuals who are already fit. And size, genetics, lung size, musculature, rib size, all of these things account for a huge variance in VO2 max. So not everybody is going to be exactly the same. Seems as though like when they do studies between twins and fraternal twins, it seems as though identical twins have a much similar VO2 max profile. And therefore it could be the case that a lot of this is determined by hereditary. Now, my dad died of complications from emphysema and had problems with his lungs his entire life, you know, so it probably behooves me to be aware of that and try to improve my cardiovascular fitness, because if hereditariness or genetics determines a lot of this, then you got to pay attention to those things. It's not all just training status though. There's also differences between males and females. There's differences in just lung volume itself, musculature. But trained females can improve Vo2 max levels so that they're very close to trained endurance runners. Again, there's going to be some individuals who respond to training and some people who don't. Where are we at? So although not all athletes are performing endurance exercises, it is the case that power sports can benefit from endurance training. It just, to me, it's probably has a lot to do with the time of year. So during off season and post season, I think it's probably reasonable for my gymnasts who do not do endurance exercise, or for flips to do endurance training and running. Because what will happen is during the off season and the post season, you'll increase your lung capacity, increase your, all of it, increase your lung capacity, increase your cardiovascular capacity. Your lungs will get bigger, your heart will get stronger. Now, if you are doing endurance exercise, you're going to be burning lots of fuel, and you're also going to be tapping into the fat-free mass, your muscle mass, for fuel. So during the season, I do not want my athletes particularly, to be doing long-term endurance training. But during the postseason and the off-season, where I don't care if there's a reduction in performance, and what I want to do is increase the effectiveness of their lungs and their heart, all right, well, then I think that all athletes are going to benefit at some point from making their heart stronger and their lungs better. It's just the timing of when I let my athletes do this stuff. I don't want them to do it during the season. I don't want them to spend calories. I do want them to improve their cardiovascular function, though. And now the chapter starts to talk about anaerobic training. Anaerobic training, specifically sprint training, high intensity interval training, Wingate tests, not Wingate tests, fartlek training, which is like high intensity hill running, stuff like that. As opposed to aerobic power, it's much more difficult to measure. Vo2 max isn't a great indicator of anaerobic power, because a Vo2 max uses oxygen and anaerobic power does not. There are some tests that you can use that uses heart rate as an estimate of power testing. With anaerobic training, there's going to be, again, increases in your, because now this is going to be more intense. It's anaerobic, much more intense in terms of the power output. So now you're going to be recruiting more of your fast twitch muscle fiber types. Because it still is utilizing type 1 muscle fiber types, there will be an increase in the size and synthesis of actin-myosin filaments within those type 2 muscle fiber types. But with anaerobic training, we're not going to be utilizing the slow glycolysis system. There's going to be, therefore, changes to the bioenergetics of the phosphocreatine system and the fast glycolysis system. A lot of these changes are based on increases in enzymes. Citrate kinase, myosin kinase, these are 2 enzymes that, if you look at changes in these enzymes based on types of training. So here's anaerobic training. What kind of anaerobic training? Well, it says here, if I do 6 seconds of high intensity training, and I look at my enzyme activity, this is one enzyme and another enzyme, and this is pre-exercise and post-exercise, and it's based on percentage of change. You can see here, there's very little change here with 6 seconds of exercise. Then you do 6 seconds of like cycle training or high intensity training, 6 seconds and then rest, 6 seconds and then rest. These people did 30 seconds of exercise and rested. And you'll notice that the enzymatic activity after 30 seconds of exercise is way higher than if I only did 6 seconds of exercise. So if you want to improve your enzymatic activity, right, what you want to do is, and say flips is trying to train this glycolytic system, because in the ATP PC system, they don't need enzymes that are going to break down glucose. But flips and my gymnasts are going to be working their glycolytic system. And I want to have a positive increase in these enzyme activities. And it looks like if I only do 6 seconds of activity, there's not going to be much of a change. There will be a change in sport performance, but these changes here at 6 seconds of activity, they say are only due to strength increases in the muscle, because it says in that graph, there's very little enzyme changes with very short bouts of high intensity exercise training. But with 30 seconds or longer of high intensity exercise training, not only is there increases in strength, but there are also increases in enzyme activity. And it's the enzyme activity that makes it so that you can burn fuel more effectively. So what kind of training should we maybe consider? You might have heard of high intensity interval training, and it's a time efficient way. What does that mean? Well, high intensity interval training results in many of the same adaptations that you experience with long bouts of endurance training. There's increased mitochondria activity, there's increased enzymes, there's increased strength of muscle contraction. So this is looking at your cytochrome oxidase activity. This is one enzyme. And this is looking at performance. Shows that after, this is pre-training and post-training. And you'll see that there's almost the exact same relationships between the cycling performance, pre and post-training, with an individual who is doing high intensity interval training versus regular training. High intensity interval training takes much less time. Like instead of running for an hour on a treadmill, what you would do is you would run for 30 seconds and then rest for 4 minutes, and run 30 seconds and rest for 4 minutes. So 30 seconds, 1 second, 30 seconds times, so 4.30. So, and I multiply that by 10, that's 120 divided by 60 equals. So it's 21 minutes as opposed to 50 minutes of high intensity interval training compared to long bouts of endurance training on a treadmill. And it apparently, according to the research, there's very similar changes in enzyme activity, cardiovascular functioning, vascularization, and all sorts of stuff. Also, CrossFit training is another form of anaerobic training, all right, similar to high intensity training, where what people are doing is they're not only doing just endurance training, they're doing endurance, anaerobic, resistance training all at the same time, trying to make it so that you can get the benefits of resistance, aerobic, and anaerobic training all at once. All right, if you take a look at the chapter on page hope you guys have the book out, but we're almost going to be done on page 280. You take a look at page 280. It's a pretty good breakdown of all of the changes that the chapter suggests. And I'll go over them real quick. In terms of resting heart rate, you can see, according to this graph on page 280, not this graph that you see here. This is a different graph. But the resting heart rate drops with training. Maximum heart rate drops with training. The stroke volume at rest increases with training. The maximum stroke volume increases with training. Cardiac output at rest doesn't change too much. The maximum cardiac output increases. The volume of the heart increases. The volume of the blood increases. Systolic blood pressure at rest stays the same. Systolic blood pressure during maximum increases a little bit. Diastolic blood pressure at rest stays the same. Diastolic blood pressure during maximum exercise decreases a bit. The expiratory volume at rest stays the same, but the ability for me to expire when I'm exercising at maximum intensity increases. Tidal volume at rest stays the same. Tidal volume during exercise increases. Your vital capacity at during exercise increases. Your residual volume stays the same. The ability to diffuse oxygen from my lung tissues to my veins increases. My Vo2 Max increases. My blood lactate level at rest stays the same. Blood lactate is more easily cleared during exercise. And typically your body weight will drop, your fat weight will drop, your fat-free weight will depending upon if you're doing resistance training. This is endurance training, and usually endurance training burns extra protein. So endurance training will reduce fat-free weight muscle mass, which is why I don't necessarily want my individuals doing long-term endurance exercise, because they'll lose their muscle mass and they need their muscle mass to do gymnastics. And I would say that that is probably, let me go here.
So a question that's often asked is, are sprinters made or born? And I guess you could say that the answer is that it's a bit of both, right? If someone has an excellent genetic endowment for sprinting, but they never train, they're not going to be a great sprinter. On the other hand, if someone has a poor genetic endowment for sprinting, if they don't have any of those characteristics from their genes that make a great sprinter, really no amount of training is going to turn them into a great sprinter. There certainly are characteristics that we can attribute to your genes, and certainly there are characteristics of great sprinters that can be improved through training. For example, on the things that we think are genetically endowed, muscle composition is one of those. You know, our muscles are made up of slow twitch muscle fibers and fast twitch muscle fibers, and we know that great sprinters have a greater proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers in their muscles. And it doesn't seem that any amount of training is very effective at converting slow twitch muscle fibers into fast twitch muscle fibers. There can be some changes in the type of fast twitch muscle fiber that can be attributed to training, but really no conversion between muscle fiber types. There are certain physical characteristics that don't have to do with the muscles that directly, that are also attributable to genetic endowment. One of those is the leverage that your muscles have. We've found that sprinters have worse leverage for their propulsive muscles than do non-sprinters. That is to say that their muscles have poorer leverage during that push-off phase as they're pushing their bodies forward out of the blocks, let's say. And this sounds like it would be a disadvantage, but when a muscle has a smaller lever arm, when it has worse leverage, that means that the muscle fibers that connect that are connected to that muscle's tendon, those muscle fibers are going to shorten less with a muscle that has a lower lever arm. That means that you're giving up leverage as a sprinter with a smaller lever arm, but you're gaining in the ability to generate force. The reason for this is that your muscle fibers will be shortening less rapidly. And we know through muscle's force velocity property that muscles that shorten less rapidly can generate force better. There are factors that can be attributed to training in sprinters. While you can't change the composition of your muscle fibers, the composition of your muscles, you can't change a slow twitch muscle fiber to a fast twitch through training. What you can do is you can increase the size of muscle fibers through training, so that the total size of a muscle, more of that size can be taken up by faster twitch muscle fibers as opposed to slower twitch muscle fibers. So if you want to get faster in terms of sprinting, if you want to be a faster sprinter, the demands in terms of sprinting are that you generate large forces and do that quickly. And so the way that you would improve the ability to do that is to train that. So doing slow resistive training is probably going to be of limited use as far as improving sprint training. It might make your muscles stronger, but only when they are contracting slowly. You want to be training the motor units that generate large forces rapidly. And so various people have proposed different methods for training large forces with high velocity. That can include high intensity running on an inclined treadmill, or perhaps running on the flat with extra resistance, pulling you backwards, say with a parachute or something like that. But the best way to do that is a little bit controversial, but it does seem that high intensity, high force training at high velocity is the way to improve those attributes.